All right. Hi, everyone. I can see that people are there, but I can't see anyone. So I'm going to start right on time. Hi, Gina. Um, so that we can kind of keep it moving. You guys can get to the third breakout session, and I can too, because there's a lot of really cool things happening today. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to make sure technology works for us correctly. Just give me 1 second to make this nice and big for you guys. Okay. So okay, perfect. So you guys see the stuff you're supposed to. All right. So hi, everyone. Welcome. So exciting to have a second annual GVRC day. My name's Allie. I am a clinical psychology PhD candidate at Rutgers, and I spend all of my research time at the GVRC and working under the mentorship of Mike and Estes. So I want to, just so you guys know, I can't see the chat when I present, but I'll definitely look at it for questions after. And I'm going to present today on a study we got funded looking at credible sources to discuss secure storage for suicide prevention. Super exciting. We literally just got IRB approval over lunch break at 12:13 p.m. It had been a long process with the IRB. But we literally just got approval, so we should start rolling with data collection next week. So spoiler alert, there's no data to present on today, but I think it'll still be informative to just talk kind of about the questions we're asking and what the implications we think might be. So I want to start off just talking a little bit about why we're talking about suicide at a firearm-related conference. Mike hit on some of this in his conversation before lunch, so I'll keep it quick so we can get to kind of the meaty stuff. But overall, most of us know this, right? Suicide is a major public health concern within the US. And while the rest of the world has really seen a decrease in suicide rates, we've continued to see an increase. So from 2000 to 2018, we saw a 33% increase, and then we saw a 4% increase in 2021 alone. And one of the reasons we're seeing such an increase in the US while other countries are not seeing this increase and are seeing a decrease is because of firearms. So firearms account for over 50%, I believe it was 53% of all suicide deaths in 2022. And they're the most lethal method. So if somebody attempts suicide with a firearm, they're rarely surviving and rarely getting a second chance. I think a lot of times we talk about suicide prevention in a silo and then gun violence prevention in a silo, and we can't really do that if we want to make progress on either issue. So suicides account for 2/3 of all firearm-related deaths in the US, which means that in order to really bring down that number of gun violence deaths per day and per year in the US, we have to start talking about suicide in this context. And same thing when it comes to suicide prevention, right? 53% of the deaths are by firearms, so we have to start talking about firearm safety and gun violence prevention. I know these numbers look depressing. The good news is we do know something that can help reduce firearm suicide rates, and that's secure firearm storage. So there's a lot of terms that we throw around when we talk about secure firearm storage. We use the term mean safety, safe storage. I think the military is using firearm leadership now. So there's lots of things that happen with these wordings. So I want to explain what I mean. So secure firearm storage for today's presentation means storing a firearm unloaded, locked, separate from ammunition, or storing it kind of outside the home during a time of crisis. So really anything that puts time and distance between somebody in a suicidal crisis and a firearm, right? That most lethal method. So we know that this is effective from a few different studies. So a real world example comes from the Israeli Defense Force. So they saw a 40% reduction in young service members' suicide rates when they instituted a policy that did not allow them to take their firearms with them on leave. We don't have an exactly similar study here in the US, but we do have some that really show us that securely storing a firearm can reduce risk for suicide for every member of a home. The curveball is a lot of firearm owners aren't engaging in secure firearm storage, and that really falls on us as researchers to find ways to better message the effectiveness of secure firearm storage and increase engagement with this. So I'm going to talk quickly about 3 studies that have started to do that, to find ways to increase the effectiveness of safe storage messaging. I'm just going to hit on these real quick, and then we'll talk about the commonalities because all of them have pretty similar results. So the first person to really do this work was Dr. Kaspar Fassi down at Johns Hopkins. In 2018, they published a study looking at who firearm owners see as credible to discuss secure firearm storage. And so they looked at secure storage broadly. And I think it was a national sample of firearm owners and said, who do you want to hear from? We followed up on that. Mike and Estes led a study looking at who they want to hear from when it comes to secure firearm storage, specifically for suicide prevention. So we kind of narrowed the focus a little bit. And in this study, we also started saying hey, firearm owners aren't all the same, right? Pretty heterogeneous group. So let's look at different groups within this. So we looked at different racial groups, we looked at military status, and we looked at like gender differences as well. And then we expanded upon that a little bit more. This was my thesis. We ran latent class analyses. So that's just a complex analysis that gives you like different groups of people. So it gave us different groups of firearm owners in the US. And we said, who do each separate group want to hear from when it comes to secure firearm storage for suicide prevention? So all these studies, like I said, have really similar results, and this is what they are. So overall, law enforcement officers and military members are consistently ranked as one of the highest credible sources. So they're the ones firearm owners are saying, like, yeah, I want to hear from them when it comes to secure firearm storage for suicide prevention. In the middle is what we've been referring to as this in-group. It's this group of like NRA, NSSF, fire manufacturers, like firearm magazines, things like that are associated with firearm or firearm culture, but they're not really ranked super high and they're not ranked super low. They're just kind of fluctuating in the middle a little bit. And then at the bottom here are physicians and celebrities. So we know that these are the least credible sources. And we also know that, gun violence prevention centers, AFSP, like other like suicide prevention organizations are also typically falling kind of down towards the physicians and celebrities as well. So we know who firearm owners say they see as credible, and we started to test the credibility. So Mike mentioned this study, which was super awesome. It was the first one who really said, like, let's see if the messenger actually has an impact on firearm storage, right? Let's see if it actually does something. So they tested if the messenger who delivers the message on secure firearm storage had an impact on willingness or openness to changing storage habits. So how open are you to storing a firearm in these number of ways in order to prevent your own suicide death or the suicide death of someone else? This is a total military sample. So all US service members, they all owned at least one firearm and they were not already storing that firearm safely. The big finding from this study that we're going to kind of carry forward with us when we talk about this study that we're here for today is that law enforcement is a particularly credible voice. So law enforcement increased willingness to change storage habits to a really high degree. So thinking about how that really maps on with previous research that found law enforcement was ranked really highly as credible, well, they're actually impacting willingness to change storage habits as well. The things that we kind of still have questions on and don't know yet is if the messenger has sustained impact. So is that impact of like, yes, like I would be more open to storing a firearm safely in the future, is that sustained after that one appointment, right? After that one survey that we do that. So is there a long-term stain of that? And does the messenger impact actual storage habits? So people might say that they're open to it, but when push comes to shove, are we actually seeing a change in storage habits? And that brings us to the current study. So we want to build upon previous research, so using a civilian sample now and seeing if some of those military findings translate over, and want to experimentally manipulate exposure to the person delivering the message to really determine, right, if they are, if the credible source impacts openness and actual storage habits to a greater degree than non-credible sources. So I'm going to go through study. I know this is a really busy slide. We'll talk through it. Don't worry. But I want to go through this and then go to AIMS because I think it'll make more sense. But if it doesn't, you guys have questions, happy to answer them. So we have 2 appointments. So they have a baseline survey and then a 1-month follow-up survey. The baseline survey, we're recruiting 520 firearm owners from the US. They're matched to the 2010 US Census data for age, race, sex, income, and education level. The reason we have 520 is because we need 336 at follow-up in order to have adequate power to make sure our results actually are saying what we want them to say, right? And Qualtrics panels told us to recruit 520, so that's what we're doing. We're going to pre-test before we do anything else. So ask how open they currently are to storing their firearms in a number of ways to prevent their own suicide attempt or the suicide attempt of a loved one, and their actual storage habits. So what are they using in or around their home on firearms? Then they're randomized to view one of 6 public health messages. So 2 from the top credible sources, 2 from like these in-groups, and then 2 from the least credible sources. And right after that, we're going to post-test them on openness again. So using the structure from that study that Mike and Craig Bryan and them did, having like pre-test, randomization, post-test. And then we're adding on this 1-month follow-up. So 1 month later, we're going to go back to them and say, hey, how open are you still to storing your firearms like in these ways in order to prevent suicide? And how are you actually storing your firearms? So this is going to help us see if that change in openness is sustained and if we have any movement on actual storage habits. At the post test, we'll also debrief them to let them know that these were created by us and that they're not actually the views of those different agencies per se. So aims, I know we hit on this, we'll go through them real fast, is to examine if the credible source who discusses secure firearm storage has an impact on openness to or actual engagement in storage habits. And we're assuming that the two most credible sources are going to impact openness and actual storage to a greater degree than the middle and bottom sources, and then that those middle sources are going to impact it to a greater degree than the bottom sources. Then our second aim is we're going to do some exploratory moderation analyses just to see if there's other factors that are impacting response to the source. So I mentioned openness and actual storage a lot, so I wanted to throw these on here real quick just so you could see what our big outcome variables were. So they're asked like how willing you'd be to use one of the following on one or more of your firearms to prevent a suicide attempt by yourself and then by somebody else. And they're presented like a whole list of things. So like storing without a firing, like removing the firing pin, storing unloaded, using a cable lock, storing outside the home temporarily. So they can choose like as many as they would do. And then actual storage habits is similar. They are asked like which ones they use on at least one firearm. So we don't know if they're using these on all firearms or which firearms they're using them on. We just know that they use them on at least one. And again, they can select all that apply here too. So the main outcomes is this. And now let's talk about the public health messages we're going to use to see if we have any changes in openness, actual storage habits. So the bottom of these got cut off, but I'll let you know what information's missing. So these are 6 public health messages. So these are our 2 top sources. So law enforcement, military. These are our 2 middle sources, which is NRA and firearm manufacturers. And then our 2 bottom ranked sources is a physician, and Bradley Cooper is our celebrity. We wanted to keep everything consistent here in order to really see if it's the messenger itself and not other factors that were accounting for like changes in openness and actual storage. So we kept their names the same. Obviously, Bradley Cooper is Bradley Cooper. Everyone else was like Bradley Clark. So there's little bios underneath here. And these 2 guys have the same occupation at their respective organizations. So they're both director of communication at the NRA and then a firearm manufacturer. Obviously, we also kept gender and race the same. So they all present as white men. And this was, again, to account just to make sure we're not like seeing differences based on race or gender as well. This is, although we had to kind of do it for that, it's also a limitation in the sense that like this is very white male centric approach and may then not resonate as well with other racial groups or other genders. So at the end of the post survey, we are asking them like, what would make this more credible? Like, what would you want this message to be? Like, what race would you have preferred to see? What gender would you have preferred to see? So we can really see like, are these messages resonating with certain groups and not others? And who do these other groups want to hear from? So the message content, I know it's small in there. I should have told you guys not to worry about reading it quite yet. I have it on the next slide for you. But it's also the same between all the sources as well. So this is the content. I'm not going to read it to you because it feels a little weird, but you guys can check it out and I'll just kind of summarize it for you. So this comes from a study by Marino and colleagues back in 2018. They did focus groups with firearm owners and wanted to create a culturally competent message on firearm safety for suicide prevention. And then this has been used in multiple other studies since then. So we're not kind of reinventing the wheel on this one. And the big things in this message are that it highlights like the importance of firearm owners as like a way of American life, the responsibility that comes with owning a firearm, why firearms are important when we talk about suicide prevention, safe storage or securely storing firearms, and just having like trust and respect for firearms, and then our friends and family too. So using the same content, I know it's small like on these messages, it's probably gonna be small on Qualtrics too. So we're just gonna have this like plopped right there as well. And then we're gonna do a quick check just to make sure they know the main thing to come out of this message and the person who delivered it for them. Okay, we're doing well on time, but I just have like one more slide and then I can take questions and all of that and get you guys over to the next presentations. But obviously we don't have the results yet, but I think there's a few impacts of this study regardless of really what the results are. The first is that we're going to be able to determine if when presented the same message, the same media platform, if the source who presents the message matters. And this is really important when we think about the fact that most of us here, right, who do work in like the research space aren't the ones that they want to hear from. So how can we form relationships with law enforcement officers, with military personnel to say like, we have the knowledge of how we can securely store firearms to reduce suicide risk. you guys are the voices they want to hear. So let's partner together and make this, message more resonate with more folks. I think this will also continue to highlight the heterogeneity of firearm owners. A lot of times we talk about them as one big group, and that's not the case. So seeing who this message resonates for, who wants to hear from different groups or different credible sources in an effort to then reach as many as we can, right? If there's specific groups of firearm owners who say like, yeah, law enforcement for sure, credible, like I'll change my storage habits. And there's another group that shocks us and says like, it's Bradley Cooper. Then, thinking of can we message differently to these two groups, and how can we reach them like through their own channels to make sure they're getting the message that's going to work the best for them. So with that, I will figure out how to stop sharing my screen, and I can take any questions you guys have. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. We'll see. Stop sharing. Okay, perfect. All right, so I'll start reading just like the question in here. Have you ever looked at the credibility of significant others, domestic partners, family members as credible messengers? Yes, it's such a good question. So family members actually ranked really highly consistently. So in my thesis was the first time we saw them ranked within like the top 3. They tended to be around 3 or 4, but for certain groups they were 3. This was tricky because we talked a lot about wanting to include them as a like option here, but we can't really like create a family member that somebody's never heard of. But I think it speaks a lot to the fact of like getting firearm safety firearm safety information to as many people as possible, even if them themselves are not the firearm owner. I think about this a lot too with the military, right? We have like dependents interact a lot on base and with military health services and other forms of care. So thinking of like, can we get the message through dependents, for example, to then bring it home and say like, hey, have you thought about this? Like I got this resource from like the health center, kind of all of those different platforms. I hope that answers your question. I don't see any other questions, but I will hang out for a minute. Okay, awesome. In case anyone does, but you can also reclaim 3 minutes before you go and jump into another presentation. Okay, I'm pumped for that, Mike. I love that. All the studies related to credible sources, I'm always here for that, for sure. Perfect. Yeah, so who knows? We might have a follow-up study for this presented next year at round 3 of GVRC Day. Thank you. Cool. So I'll let you guys kind of head out and go check out some of the other ones. Thank you for the IRB approval. Congrats. Yeah, it was big lunchtime news. But have a great rest of your guys' day and enjoy the rest of the presentations.